Thanking God for, among other things, this time repetition. In this chapter, it took me quite a few repetitions to begin to understand, I think, what might be going on in the book of Joel. But in Joel chapter 2, let's call it He Calls, understanding that it is going to start with a call to one people and seem to end with a call to another. He's going to seem like he's starting out with a call to a great army and end up with a call to a group of survivors in this chapter that we will go through twice, essentially a gross or general kind of survey. Once again, just following the paragraph breaks of the English Standard Version, but then let's go through it in a little bit more detail. Understanding that the first how many verses or so? The first 11 verses or so are going to seem to represent the call to that army, after which verses 12 through 17 are going to begin saying, yet even now, in a section that is going to talk about the way in which he might still have mercy on his people against whom he's calling that army. Once again, the people of Israel. As in verses 18 through roughly 27, he is going to indeed have mercy on his people. But the question is, who's actually going to be able to take advantage of that mercy? As the last portion of the chapter, verses 28 through 32, was it 32, it seems, are going to talk about a future time or afterward. After the days of that mercy, there is some future time, not necessarily specified, that is then going to be quoted by Peter in the New Testament, linked to the day of Pentecost in Acts chapter 2. Going on in more detail, though, it is going to seem that that great army that he is talking about is going to be the very same army he was talking about in chapter 1, at which point, not at which point, by the time we get to the end of this chapter, he is literally going to say the army he is talking about is not an army of people, but an army of locusts. Understanding that verse 1 is going to start saying, blow a trumpet in Zion, sound an alarm on my holy mountain. Let all the inhabitants of the land tremble, for the day of the Lord is coming near. This is one of those instances where the day of the Lord is going to be a term that is used over and over, this time helping us to understand the way in which it can talk about a day of judgment before the great final day of judgment that is more often, at least for us, attributed to the Revelation. However, there are going to seem to be some parallels between even Joel and the Revelation when he describes those locusts. Verse 2, talking about their like, never having been seen before, nor will it be seen again, a phrase that you will see about different kinds of plagues, not meaning the end times or the end of all plagues, but just a unique nature of the kind of plague that God is bringing in a certain situation that seems to apply here as well. However, verses 4 through roughly 7, really 4 through 6, are going to talk about their appearance. Now, the paragraph breaks, we're still going to use paragraph breaks. 4 through 5 are going to talk about their appearance. 6 through 9 are going to talk about their way, seeming that they are likened unto warriors, even though some of their behavior is not going to be specifically what you would associate with warriors, meaning they run along walls the way that you would expect locusts to run along walls, not human warriors. Going on to say in verse 10 and 11, or sorry, verse 10 through 11, that they are literally his army before whom the earth quakes. Going on, though, in verses 12 through 17, as we mentioned, he is going to say, yet even now, return to me with all your heart, a familiar theme that we will, once again, not be able to be saved on our own terms. This chapter reminds us as well that God's people have the potential to reach a conclusion that doesn't have to end ugly like this. But the reality of the history shows that they did not avert the catastrophe. As we're going to see later on, he is not only talking about what seems to be a plague of locusts. It seems in verse 3 that he might be talking about drought, understanding that going back to verses 19 and 20 of chapter 1, he was talking about a fire, but it was the kind of fire that also devoured the water. And fire does not typically lick up water the way that drought can. And so it's not absolutely clear that the fire he was talking about in chapter 1 and likewise in chapter 2 is drought, but it seems like that is quite likely what he is talking about, that will also devastate the land along with the army of locusts. However, going on in verses 18 through 27, as we mentioned, he is going to have mercy, but I'm going to wait till the end to talk about the difference between the mercy they could have had at their potential and the mercy that he is guaranteeing that some will see. But the one thing that I do want to emphasize is his promise in verse 25 to restore. The way in which he's talking about his restoration is going to make it clear that his army seems to be these locusts, as he's going to say, I will restore to you the years that the swarming locust has eaten, the hopper, the destroyer, and the cutter, my great army, which I sent among you. Seems to basically make the riddle clear at that point. God's defining it for us, understanding that the only way to really have certainty with biblical imagery, not energy, is to have God interpret it for us, either directly through his prophets or through his later writers, the apostles, and those who were blessed enough to pen the pages of the Bible for us. Everything else, honestly, is guesswork. But going on from that, once again, in that same theme, Paul in Acts chapter 2 is going to help us understand at least one application of the final section of this chapter, verses 28 through the end, that I will simply read. After the more famous part in verses 28 and 29, talking about the way in which he is going to pour out his spirit on all flesh and some of the signs that they will see when he pours out his spirit on all flesh, verses 30 through the end of the chapter are going to read, and I will show wonders in the heavens and on the earth, blood and fire and columns of smoke. The sun shall be turned to darkness and the moon to blood before the great and awesome day of the Lord comes. And it shall come to pass that everyone who calls on the name of the Lord shall be saved. For in Mount Zion and in Jerusalem there shall be those who escape, as the Lord has said, and among the survivors shall be those whom the Lord calls. Thus our title. In this chapter that once again begins and ends with a call from God to people. A call that reminded me of a story that Jesus told, recorded in, I believe it is, the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 22, when he is talking about a wedding feast, seeming to symbolize God's call to people. That story is going to be summarized in verse 14, where it says, for many are called, but few are chosen. Understanding that the call went out to many, there was one who came in improperly dressed for the function. Not so much talking about physical dress codes, but understanding that dress biblically is a metaphor for spiritual principles of one cleansing. So by the time you get to the Revelation, it's going to talk about the way in which those assembled before God have had their robes cleansed by the blood of the Lamb. And then likewise, when it's talking about the marriage supper of the Lamb later on in the Revelation, it's going to talk about the way that her garments or her fine linen garments are the righteous deeds of the saints. Without going too far into something that really deserves more of a sermon than a summary, basically, once again, we are getting another perspective, as we say, on the fact that we will not be saved on our own terms. And the sad part about Joel chapter 2 is there is a distinction between that middle or that second section we talked about, where the people had the potential to avoid, as we mentioned in the last chapter, needless suffering, and the reality that most of the time, and I think especially as history bears out in this particular case, that's exactly what they endured. It was needless suffering. Reminding me of the way in which the book of Joel seems to give us another perspective on, as we kind of mentioned in the first chapter, these cycles in the history of God's people where they seem to be bargain hunting with God, looking for a lower price or a lower level of commitment in spaces where God has required us to give all. Reminding me of the phrase, penny wise, pound foolish. It seems that sometimes we bargain hunt with God in the way that we might bargain hunt for stuff. However, if you have ever bargain hunted for very long, you know that disappointing feeling when you get a price you think you like, only to have to rely on a good or a service that was far less than what you thought you might have been getting. And so likewise, the people of God in the book of Joel were able to negotiate a better price with God, only to realize that that better price was going to come with needless suffering. Which is why we sometimes say, my prayer for you is my prayer for me. May God help deliver us from the temptation to try to bargain with him in circumstances when he has simply called us to give all and do all that his son has commanded.